Hello, friends. We are excited that our No Small Endeavor Plus community is growing. Now, all of our friends in the No Small Endeavor orbit are intelligent, smarter than average, winsome, good-looking, while the members of NSE Plus seem especially so because they are enjoying ad-free episodes as well as special subscriber-only content once a month where we discuss habits and practices learned from our guests over the years. And those special episodes have been a lot of fun, personal and practical. I love sitting down with our producer, Jacob Lewis, and recording those for you. And so we would love to have you join us. And your NSC Plus membership helps support the show. So because of all of these things, we'd love for you to join the NSC Plus family. Just go to nosmallendeavor.com, click subscribe, and start catching up on our subscriber-only episodes today. Again, go now, nosmallendeavor.com, click subscribe, and start catching up. See you there. I'm Lee C. Camp, and this is No Small Endeavor, exploring what it means to live a good life.
The government had these prison centers up and down the West Coast, and even President Roosevelt referred to these camps as concentration camps.
That's Dr. Fred Korematsu, founder and executive director of the Fred Korematsu Institute, named after her father. Fred was a civil rights activist who was imprisoned along with other Japanese Americans in the United States following the attack on Pearl Harbor. We'll also hear from Pastor Eugene Cho, CEO of Bread for the World, as he explores what it means to seek justice as a Korean-born American citizen who's committed to practices of curiosity and listening, despite his not always receiving the same courtesies.
I don't know of a single Asian person in my life who's not heard the phrase, "Go back home."
I'm Lee C. Camp, and this is No Small Endeavor, exploring what it means to live a good life. When the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor in 1941, the nation was in shock. Reactions were fast, dramatic, and often rooted in fear. President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066 roughly 2 months later. The executive order authorized the forced removal of all persons deemed a threat to national security from the West Coast to so-called relocation centers further inland. The policy resulted in the incarceration of approximately 120,000 Japanese Americans. Fred Korematsu was a Japanese American who, when called to report for relocation, refused to leave his home. He was arrested and held. He appealed his case, which made its way to the United States Supreme Court in 1944. Then, the nation's highest court affirmed Mr. Korematsu's conviction and judged it lawful. It was not until 1983, almost 40 years later, that the case was reopened and reheard, and Mr. Korematsu's conviction was cleared. In the pursuit of a good life, one of the things we continue to learn from our guests is the importance of holding before ourselves moral exemplars. In this case, today, brave souls who have refused to submit to the caprice of injustice. And in honor of such brave souls for this AAPI Heritage Month, we turn to two such good souls, Mr. Eugene Cho and Mr. Fred Korematsu.
He was an American citizen, the son of Japanese immigrants. He grew up just like any other American kid and loved sports and to be with his friends.
This is Dr. Fred Korematsu, the daughter of Fred Korematsu and the founder and president of the Fred Korematsu Institute. Karen has carried on her father's legacy as a public speaker, educator, and civil rights advocate. She shares his passion for social justice and education and established the Institute in 2009 to advance racial equity and human rights for all.
When the bombing of Pearl Harbor occurred on December 7, 1941, he was suspicious that maybe Japan might do something crazy because they were invading China and other countries. And the Executive Order 9066 was issued by President Franklin Roosevelt on February 19, 1942, that would forcibly remove anyone of Japanese ancestry from the West Coast and put them in American concentration camps. And this was all done without due process of law. So Bill of Rights were totally denied. There was no access to an attorney, any charges, or any day in court. And my father learned about the Constitution in high school. So he thought, Why should he have to go to a prison camp when he had done nothing wrong? He was 23 years old at the time. And so, of course, he's old enough to make up his own mind. He just wanted to live his life as an American citizen. So he refused to report. He felt that the government was wrong and he was right as an American citizen to take a stand. It wasn't complicated to him.
So Fred, 23-year-old, hid in the Bay Area and evaded arrest for about a month. But eventually he was spotted and ultimately arrested. When you think about your father, what do you think were experiences or resources that helped him become a 23-year-old who had that kind of courage?
When he was in high school, he had gone to the town next to him for a haircut, and it was a Caucasian barber. And he refused to give my father a haircut. He said, "You get out of here. We don't cut the hair of people of your kind. And I never want to see you again." So he even had the same experience when he went to a diner to have something to eat in the afternoon, and he was refused service. When you have those types of experiences, it helps to shape your decisions later on. You can take this in two different roads, right? You can take the road that makes you angry and aggressive and a chip on your shoulder, or you can go down the road where you want to make some positive change and to do the right thing. My father had moral principles. He was quiet, he was introverted, but he was a person of his conviction. And he never, he never had a swear word in his life. I mean, I never heard him swear at all, which I know is very unusual. People kind of don't believe me, but he was like that. My mother was like that too. But it was that generation. He never blamed anyone. He wasn't angry. In fact, he said, "Protest, but not with violence. Otherwise, they won't listen to you, but don't be afraid to speak up." And that's the way that he lived his life. He treated everyone like he wanted to be treated. And it's that quiet conviction.
That quiet conviction led Fred to appeal his case.
My father fought his case all the way to the Supreme Court.
But the fear and terror that followed the bombing of Pearl Harbor drove the United States to publicly justify their actions. In December of 1944, Fred was still found guilty of disobeying what was deemed a legitimate military order.
Back then, in 42, it was called military necessity. Now we call it national security. It's one of the worst Supreme Court decisions in U.S. history, number one. But number two, it was not unanimous.
It's important to note the three dissenting opinions from Mr. Korematsu's 1944 case because they point out the dangers of the precedent justifying the detention of individuals based upon their race during times of social or national emergency.
Jackson referred to it as "this lies around like a loaded weapon, ready for anyone to pick up and use with a plausible cause." And actually, the Bush administration did that after 9/11, 2001, as a possible reason to round up Arab and Muslim Americans and put them in American concentration camps. Justice Murphy in 1944 called it the ugly abyss of racism, and Justice Owen Roberts said it was unconstitutional. Even President Roosevelt referred to these camps as concentration camps. The inhumanity of what this all represents, in addition to the violation of people's civil rights. When they were ordered to report to these detention prison camps, they could only take with them what they could carry in two hands, period. And you didn't know where you were going, how long you were going to be away, what the weather conditions were going to be like. And you could try to sell what you could on 10 cents on the dollar if you were lucky, give it to your possessions to neighbors. Hopefully they would keep them. But a lot of people didn't think the Japanese Americans were coming back because it was 3 or 4 years later. Or these possessions got destroyed. And people lost their property, they lost their homes, they lost their businesses. It really was an injustice against American citizens. 2/3 of 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry were American citizens. Think about that. And 1/3 were children under the age of 18 years old.
What were the camps like once they were incarcerated?
This is another part of the story that people don't know about. The government had these detention assembly prison centers up and down the West Coast. And then eventually they constructed 10 concentration camps across this country, from California to Arkansas. The government and the military, in their haste, found horse stalls, basically, racing tracks up and down the West Coast. And all the government did was to whitewash horse stalls. And you had a dirt floor, a light bulb, an iron army cot, a blanket, and it still smelled like manure. There was dysentery in these detention prison centers, and they had to live like that for at least 4 months. And then they were shipped off by train to one of the concentration camps across this country. And they were just barracks. They were wood barracks with tar paper, no insulation. There was no central heating. Sometimes it would my family went to Topaz, Utah. It would be, hotter than Hades in the summertime and freezing cold in the wintertime. Some people died just because of the conditions. You might have a potbelly stove. And, you might have 6 families in one barrack. And the way they define those areas by a rope across the width with a blanket. And people had to live like that for 3 or 4 years. It totally disrupted families, but they had to learn how to create their own little communities, create their own education, build hospitals, try to carry on with their lives. And they even had baseball in the camps. I mean, you couldn't take a baseball bat with you, mind you, because that was considered to be a weapon, for goodness sakes. So then they had to have friends send in kind of, these sports equipment or even educational materials or musical instruments.
Famous columnist Westbrook Pegler in the Los Angeles Times said, "The Japanese in California should be under armed guard to the last man and woman right now, and to hell with habeas corpus until the danger is over." What do you do with that sort of blunt lack of consideration for the humanity of other people?
The first reaction is I just identify them as being ignorant. Prejudice is ignorance. And the only way that we can fight that, and our most powerful weapon, is education. This is the history of our systemic racism in this country. It kind of goes on and on and on. The faces may change, but the outright racism is still there. So then I take those, when I hear those remarks, take that as opportunity, because that's what we're hearing now, isn't it? The anti-Asian hate and violence that's going on currently in this country. And it's a lack of education about our different cultures. We're all American. And even this country was built on the backs of immigrants, for goodness sakes, like my grandparents. So all of a sudden, it's like immigration has become a dirty word, and we treat people with this outright racism and disrespect because we don't understand their cultures and the struggles that they've all had.
About 40 years after Fred Korematsu's case made its way to the U.S. Supreme Court and justice was denied him, the case was reopened in 1983. The original legal argument against Mr. Korematsu was that military necessity justified detention of Japanese Americans, but that was not, in fact, the case.
It took almost 40 years to find the evidence in Washington, D.C., the smoking gun that proved there was no military necessity for the Japanese Americans to be incarcerated. Number one. There was never any evidence of any spying or espionage up and down the West Coast. Number two, Professor Peter Irons and researcher Aiko Yoshinaga found this smoking gun. And at the time of my father's Supreme Court hearing in 1944, the Department of Justice had lied to the Supreme Court, had withheld evidence, and altered evidence. And since my father had served his sentence, and there was 2 other Supreme Court cases, Hirabayashi and Yasui, that had to do with disobeying the curfew, that they were able to reopen up these Supreme Court cases. because of this information that was not given at the time. I mean, who knows what the Supreme Court would have decided had they had all this information. And there was even reports that were kept from the Supreme Court. The Naval Ringo report said there was never any spying or espionage. J. Edgar Hoover, of all people, even said that. He said there's no reason for the Japanese Americans to be incarcerated. So
Wow.
that type of evidence was withheld from the Supreme Court. It was absolutely a miscarriage of justice.
At one point, the U.S. government offered Fred Korematsu a pardon. His wife, Karen's mother, replied without mincing any words.
Actually, it's my father that should really pardon the government. This is my mother, the outspoken woman from Greenville, South Carolina, a Southern girl.
Yeah, a Southern girl. Yeah, we like that. We like that Southern girl stuff.
Yeah, absolutely.
The district court overturned Fred Korematsu's conviction. The legal precedent of Korematsu set by the Supreme Court in 1944, however, has not been explicitly overturned in a subsequent case before the Supreme Court. In the 2018 case, Trump versus Hawaii, Chief Justice John Roberts did repudiate the Korematsu ruling, leading Justice Sonia Sotomayor in her dissenting opinion to conclude nonetheless that the court has taken, quote, the important step of finally overruling Korematsu, end quote. You're listening to No Small Endeavor and our conversation with Karen Korematsu and Eugene Cho. I love hearing from you. Tell us what you're reading, who you're paying attention to, or send us feedback about today's episode. You can reach me at lee@nosmallendeavor.com. You can get show notes for this episode in your podcast app or wherever you listen. These notes include links to resources mentioned in this episode, as well as a PDF of my complete interview notes and a full transcript. We would be most delighted if you tell your friends about No Small Endeavor and invite them to join us on the podcast, because it helps extend the reach of the beauty, truth, and goodness we are seeking to sow in the world. Coming up, Eugene Cho. Hello, my friends. Are you looking to find those true stories no one has ever told you about? Then you should check out the chart-topping podcast, Here's Where It Gets Interesting, hosted by longtime teacher Sharon McMahon, who you may know from her viral Instagram account, Sharon Says So. Here's Where It Gets Interesting will ignite your curiosity about the fascinating stuff that was not in history textbooks, like the sweeping history of Native Americans in the U.S., or the unknown stories that led to former Vice President Hubert Humphrey's pivotal impact in the civil rights movement. Not to mention, Sharon's joined by notable thought leaders, including former U.S. Representative Adam Kinzinger and No Small Endeavor friend and pastor Esau McCauley, who share insights about history, culture, and politics. So get the facts and listen to Here's Where It Gets Interesting with Sharon McMahon, wherever you get your podcasts. You've mentioned now education perhaps 3 times, and as I was preparing for our conversation, even my wife and I, my wife received quite a good private education as a high school student. I was raised in public schools in Alabama, she in private school in Tennessee. But both of us do not recollect having been taught anything about the Japanese internment camps during World War II, or very, very little about, if any, about Asian American racism. How do you account for that?
Education has not been the high priority in this country as it should be. It's always at the bottom of the list as far as need and importance, right? So the obvious is look at what we pay teachers in this country, across this country. We pay them a pittance, but we entrust them with our children to teach them. Now, if the curriculum is not there, like you said, you might have a sentence that a teacher talks about during maybe a history lesson, and that's kind of about it. So it's the lack of in-depth curriculum that needs to be pushed and offered across this country. The Korematsu Institute works on a national level. We work with all 50 states, with the National Council for Social Studies Teachers, which is the largest social studies teacher educator organization in the United States. Plus, I do work overseas even. But what we're struggling now is trying to get the dollars for education. And what I've also been involved with, especially in California right now, is ethnic studies. Ethnic studies is an important discipline to have not only high school, but elementary and middle school students learn. It's a way of learning about different cultures, about how the history in humanity has led us up to this road of racism now. And it's important to reflect our education as all the faces of America as we see them. This is the path of what does it mean to be an American in this country? That's what my father represents. We have Fred Korematsu Day of Civil Liberties in the Constitution on his birthday of January 30th in California, Hawaii, Virginia, Florida, New York City, and now I can say Arizona in perpetuity. It's not a holiday yet. We're working this on a national level, we hope, because he represents the Asian American and the MEMSA community, the marginalized. And that's what we need to reflect in this country. We have Martin Luther King Jr., Cesar Chavez, Rosa Parks. Where's the Asian American? And that tells our story.
Yeah.
You know, we need to share our stories of our different cultures and our struggles and our families.
For our last question, I'd like to ask you to reflect upon something you said earlier about your father's experience, where he had this traumatic experience and then he had a choice. He had a choice between one of two ways of how he was going to respond, the bitterness on the one hand, or seeking to make a difference in the world, proactive, positive difference in the world. And then you've also chosen to extend that legacy of trying to make a difference in the world. And so how have you found personal resources and personal strength to continue down that route of trying to make a difference in the world? What keeps you going in this sort of work you're seeking to do in the world?
My father never gave up hope that someday he would be able to reopen up his Supreme Court case. He didn't know how he was going to do that. He didn't know any attorneys all those almost 40 years. But he just didn't give up hope. And he's my example. He's my hero. And I feel that it's my responsibility to carry on his legacy and to carry on his work. Because even though his federal conviction was overturned in 1983, he could have said, well, you know, I'm an American citizen now. You know, I've been proven right. I'm just going to kind of retire. But he crisscrossed this country as well, speaking to all different audiences about his experiences, because he didn't want something like the Japanese American incarceration to happen again. And obviously, we come very close to making these same mistakes. We need to stop repeating history. It's that simple. And while I'm on this earth, I'm going to do everything I can to make sure that we do that, because I don't want future generations to have to go through all this struggle of racism and marginalization and hate and violence that we are seeing now across culturally, right? What people also don't know is that it was the civil rights movement of the 60s with African Americans that gave the encouragement for the Japanese Americans to fight for redress and reparations, which resulted in the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, which was the official apology by President Reagan on behalf of the country for incarcerating Japanese Americans during World War II. The shame and the stigma was lifted. This is the road that we need to go down to make positive change. One of my friends late in life was Congressman John Lewis. And I was standing there in a pilgrimage at the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And he encouraged us all to march. And that's what we need to do, is we need to march together to make a difference and to make people aware of these issues. But we can make change and we must take action. We need to carry on the conversation, but now is a time for action. And we all can be part of the solution and not the problem.
We've been talking to Dr. Karen Korematsu, the founder and executive director of the Fred T. Korematsu Institute. She's also the daughter of the late civil rights icon, Fred Korematsu. Thank you so much, Dr. Korematsu.
Thank you. And remember my father's words, stand up for what is right and don't be afraid to speak up. Thank you. Go home to where you came from.
Those are the painful words Karen Korematsu says her father often heard from white Americans in the 1940s. But these words echo through the decades, some 80 years later, to our next guest, another Asian American justice seeker.
I don't know of a single Asian person in my life who's not heard the phrase, go back home.
That's Eugene Cho, a pastor and a justice seeker. He's also the founder of One Day's Wages, an organization which seeks to make a lasting impact in the fight against extreme poverty. He's currently the president of Bread for the World, an organization with a mission to help end hunger by 2030.
I was born in Seoul, South Korea, immigrated when I was 6 years old. I'm the youngest of three sons. My parents robbed me of the privilege of potentially becoming a K-pop star. That is not possible anymore. They weren't able to go to school. They experienced extreme hunger and poverty, having so much hunger pangs that memories of having to pull out grass from the ground and to consume it. And so it's an example of one of those immigrant stories where they were seeking a better opportunity for their children, a chance for their three sons to go to college, to become educated, and to have a better life for themselves.
So you come with your parents, age 6. What are some of your memories as a young boy of being an immigrant to the United States?
There's many, even though simultaneously, I think I've also repressed some of them because you experience hardship and challenges being seen as an other. But some of my most vivid memories, number one, is getting on the airplane for the very first time in Seoul, Korea to San Francisco. I had never obviously been on an airplane, getting in on one. That in itself was the most terrifying experience. The second most vivid example is getting off the airplane and seeing for the very first time white people. And then 1 week later, to be on the public bus system in San Francisco called the Muni bus system, and to be a student in the first grade, that was traumatic. I became incredibly reclusive because I was so afraid to raise my hands during class. And I share this because I think I've made some peace with it now. There's probably another reason why I married a therapist who's offering me free therapy for life, basically. But, I flunked first grade because while I worked hard, I remember my parents receiving a report card with the words, Eugene has very deep, intense social issues, including the inability to go to the restroom. And here's the thing, Ali, it was the fear of raising my hand as a first grader in a room of 25 other people, not knowing how to speak English. And so on the one or two occasions a week when I could not hold my bladder, I would pee in my pants. And first graders, kids, teenagers can also be very ruthless and blunt. And so I had a very bad reputation as being a peeing Eugene. It was hard. And eventually these things led to me wondering, who am I? Where do I belong? Where is my home? And the phrase that I heard ever since I was an immigrant, go back home.
Mm.
Gosh, I'm 50 years old now, so about 44 years hearing that comment or question, where are you from? Or go back home. In some ways, every adolescent begins to have identity questions, but not one that I think speaks directly to belonging. Where is your home? So I really began to wrestle with that, which then began to spiral me into some anger issues. I was really angry at my parents for making the decision to immigrate to bring us to the United States. And so when I was in middle school, I actually had the opportunity to go back to Korea to visit for the summer for the first time. And I looked at that as my source of deep liberation and a sense of meaning. And what was shocking to me, which then only ratcheted my identity crisis even more, was that when I was in Korea for that 2 months, I actually heard that very same statement said to me by native Koreans: go back home.
We're going to take a short break, but coming right up, more from Eugene Cho about finding signs of hope and connection in spite of the racist and social barriers that all too often isolate us. Hey there! Did you know that we have a newsletter? Just imagine if you could have one of your favorite ethics professors send you a list of things to reflect on, think about, practical actions with which to experiment, all on your way to sorting through what it might mean to live a good life. Well, that is the NSE Notebook. I riff on themes and topics related to the show and our guests. Sign up for my NSE Notebook today at nosmallendeavor.com/newsletter. Before the break, we just heard Eugene recount growing up as a first-generation immigrant from South Korea to the United States, where he experienced challenges to his sense of belonging, both in the U.S. and in the country of his birth. We turn now to the present moment. So in this time in which we are continuing to see such polarization, I would invite you to one or both avenues of response. What are things that give you hope? Or second, what are daily practices, habits, wisdom that you hold on to as crucial for you in living a good life as a human being in a time like this?
Yeah. Well, thank you for asking that question. Like you, I'm fully aware, even with our limited understanding and scope of the brokenness of our world. And the last year and a half, 14, 15 months in our nation and around the world, I mean, it's unthinkable to try to grasp what we've experienced. Collective trauma, the global pandemic, social injustice, police brutality, to see Black and brown bodies slain. We've seen the unimaginable surge and rise of Asian American Pacific Islander hate and racism. I've had conversations that are just really painful. So it's not just news, it's very personal. 6 weeks ago, I had a really bad fight with my father. And I'll get to your question, but I want your listeners to know how deeply painful the surge of AAPI hate and racism has been.
If you're unfamiliar with the acronym AAPI, it stands for Asian American and Pacific Islander.
And it's been, again, very dear, very close. I don't know of a single Asian person in my life who's not heard the phrase "go back home" or to be labeled and to shouted slurs over the past year. There's been churches in Seattle that have been vandalized with some of the most violent rhetoric. I just had a friend who's a pastor of a church in New Jersey. During their Good Friday services, they got hacked in by folks that began to scream the most vile comments, bomb them with pornography. And this was a family Good Friday service.
Wow.
So I just want people to know that, beyond these headlines, this is happening all around us. But 6 weeks ago, I'm having a conversation with my dad. It escalates into a pretty difficult fight. Now, I'm not afraid of my father anymore. He's 85. I can take him in a wrestling match if I need to. I just want him to know that in the case that he hears this conversation. But the reason why we're having this fight is because out of the blue, he is insisting on buying a gun. 85 years old. insisting on buying a gun. And of course, I'm asking, what's going on? Why are you wanting to buy a gun? And there's something that just hurts when you hear your 85-year-old father who literally shakes as he walks because of his age, how afraid he is. And he feels the need to protect himself and his wife, my mom. It just hurts so much to hear that. I don't share this too often. This year was the first time since being a young boy post-immigration where after you hear the phrase "go back home," my wife and I, for the first time this year, actually had a conversation. Is it time to leave? Which is ridiculous because this is my home. I grew up here. I love this country. I love Seattle. We're moving to DC. I've got a job that is hard, but it's making a difference in the world. But I think it's just, if anything, I'm not trying to overly dramatize. I'm trying to give people the sense that this is what a lot of AAPI folks are struggling with, which then I think makes your question that much more poignant. Like, what gives you a sense of hope during this time? And the reason why I wanted to first highlight some of these challenges is I don't believe in false hope. I don't believe in giddy hope. I don't believe in happy, clappity clap, let's Disneyize, sanitize everything kind of hope. I think that's dangerous. It's not authentic. I think it's actually harmful. It doesn't lead us to lament. And we need lament in order to experience hope. Jürgen Moltmann, who wrote a seminal book on hope, The Theology of Hope, he once said something to the extent, genuine hope is not blind optimism. It has eyes to see the suffering around and yet believes in the future. That's given me a lot of resolve. I don't want to be blind to the suffering around me. That's dangerous fatalism. It's not a healthy spirituality. But at the same time, I don't believe that the answer to all things begins and ends on what we see and the circumstances around us. So that gives me a sense of hope and resolve. And I also just want to, again, every day keep acknowledging that while we can speak of evil and hate and destruction, that I will also want to make sure that we leave plenty of room in our hearts and our mind to acknowledge the beauty around us, the joy around us, the hospitality around us, the friendship around us. It may not sell as well because our society runs on the currency of fear, but I refuse to believe that it is dominated by hate because I do not believe that's true.
In Eugene's recent book, Thou Shalt Not Be a Jerk, he has a chapter entitled Thou Shalt Listen and Build Bridges. For someone who's received a fair amount of hate from others, he has dedicated his life to being curious, empathetic, and building bridges. And he invites others to step into that same posture as well.
So many people are afraid. We're anxious. That's the thickness of air around us, especially now. And so when I speak with my white neighbors, my white friends, my white congregants, I think there is that fear that they might somehow be overlooked, that they're losing something, that they no longer matter. And I just want to acknowledge that in a culture where it sometimes feels as if there's a lot of heaviness of accusation and pummeling of quote unquote, white America, and for those who might identify as white evangelicals. My hope is just simply just to acknowledge that there is that psychology that's impacting them as well as so many of us. And that when I or others are speaking about wanting justice and equality, ultimately, it's not just merely for ourselves or those that look like me or think like me or feel like me, but it's really a desire to see human flourishing be about human flourishing. It's really about all of us. This is the reason why I think we can't operate with a mentality of scarcity. We can't operate on a mentality of those who have and those who don't have. We can't operate on a mentality of hate and injustice. So again, I want to just first begin by sharing that. But I would just say, from an Asian American, from a Korean, from an AAPI experience, if there is a handful of things that I would ask people to consider to see, number one is this: we're not making these things up. This is real, because I still get this question, whether it's said to me respectfully or disrespectfully. It's basically something like this: maybe you need thicker skin. Maybe you're imagining things. Everyone's very traumatized right now. Maybe you're just imagining all of this violence. But when there's documented, an organization called AAPI Hate, they documented about nearly 4,000 Asian American hate crimes and incidents in the past year. This is just documented. I know it's higher because my wife and our kids and our extended family, we've not reported some of the things that we've experienced. So I know it's higher. It's the tip of the iceberg. That's the first thing. We're not making these things up. Please don't tell us to get thicker skin. That's just cruel. The second thing that I would say is that Asian American history is American history. It's not something separate. We're part of the larger collective in both its beauty and also its depravity as well. We're part of that. And so when I speak about some of the AAPI hate, we're not just talking about what transpired as a result of the pandemic, as a result of the rise in anti-Asian rhetoric. We're talking about history like People in Hall in 1854. We're talking about the China Massacre of 1871. We're talking about the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. We're talking about the San Francisco plague outbreak. We're talking about the Japanese incarceration during World War II. We're talking about KKK, their engagement with Asian communities, particularly with the Vietnamese in Texas. We're talking about the LA riots. We're talking about 9/11 inspired kind of hatred, particularly against Southeast Asians. It's part of our American history. And so even as we acknowledge good things, we need to have the courage to acknowledge some of those painful things as well. And I guess the last thing that I would just say, for the sake of being concise, is I would love for people then to say, how do I stand in solidarity? And I think you can't do it without listening. You can't do it without listening. Listen to our stories, listen to our pain, and then listen to our desire to say, what does it look like for us to build a just society that speaks about human flourishing? I think that's really important. And during this time, one of the ways that you stand in solidarity is, yes, you listen, but you've got to speak up. You have to speak up. By now, some of us may have seen the video of a security camera that showed a 65-year-old Filipina woman, grandmother, who was walking to church in New York. And she is kicked, pummeled with full force on the streets. And there are 3 security guards inside a building who sees what's going on, and they refuse to do nothing. In fact, one of them decides to close the door. So this is happening, and we need everyone of every single ethnic group to speak about this, because this sort of anti-Asian racist rhetoric and violence, it's not just happening from one small segment of people. It's being inflicted by Black, brown, white. It's happening all around our larger society and nation, and actually around the world. And so we need people to speak up, that when they hear things that are racist and denigrating, we've got to speak up and say, hey, that's not cool. That's not right. That's not proper. That's not acceptable. And certainly when we see violence inflicted, there needs to be strength in solidarity in numbers.
How does someone who, as a first grader, had a fear of raising their hand in class such that it led to sharp embarrassment in front of your classmates, who then, as a adolescent, develops a stuttering problem because of your social anxiety, how does one move from that to being someone who has the capacity to stand publicly or to write publicly so that you're going to get castigated by people on either the right or the left? How does that happen?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's one that I ponder sometimes. And I don't want to over spiritualize my answer, but this is my most authentic answer. This is my truthful answer, small t, truthful answer. By the grace of God. I truly believe that. To go from a very angry, suicidal, depressed young man who was struggling with all of those things. And in high school, and this was as I was wrestling with kind of those more existential questions in my life, during high school, I probably had one of those breakthrough moments of my life. As a junior in high school, at the zenith of some of my fear and anxiety, I realized that I needed to confront some of my fears. If I didn't, it was going to paralyze me for the rest of my life. And so I identified the act which I considered to be the scariest thing that I could ever do at that moment as a 17-year-old. And that was to audition for a school play.
Huh.
And I did. I auditioned for a school play. It was Midsummer Night's Dream by Bill Shakespeare, but I was cast for the wall. And I remember it very vividly, the emotional wrestling I had to do every single day for a 3-week production of plays on the weekends. But I look back and I'm so proud of that moment. I was not expecting to get so emotional sharing this story. It's been a while since I shared this story, but I think if I had the privilege of speaking to 17-year-old Eugene right at this moment, I would just say, I'm so proud of you, because I know how much it took for me to do that. So that's one of the big moments. And then, I think again and again, because the phrase of being fearless, I think, is ridiculous. No one's fearless. I think we're
Right.
all afraid. Courage is when we choose to acknowledge our fear and choose to engage it, even if that means we're trembling in doing it. And so, now as a 50-year-old, every single day I struggle with my fear and insecurity every day. And I'm being very truthful here. But I think this is what it means to be human. We acknowledge these things, and yet we decide to move forward little by little. Sometimes you take a couple steps back, sometimes you move forward, but that's been kind of the story of my life.
Thank you for that. It's very beautiful. Grateful for you sharing those things. We've been talking to Eugene Cho, author of Thou Shalt Not Be a Jerk, A Christian's Guide to Engaging Politics, and most recently, the president of Bread for the World, from his home there in Seattle, Washington. Thank you, Eugene, so much for the beautiful conversation today.
Thank you.
You've been listening to No Small Endeavor and our episode with Fred Korematsu, founder and executive director of the Fred T. Korematsu Institute, and Eugene Cho, author, pastor, and CEO of Bread for the World. We gratefully acknowledge the support of Lilly Endowment Incorporated, a private philanthropic foundation supporting the causes of community development, education, and religion, and the support of the John Templeton Foundation, whose vision is to become a global catalyst for discoveries that contribute to human flourishing. Our thanks to all the stellar team that makes this show possible, who do indeed do stellar work and great work to make all this possible. Christy Bragg, Jacob Lewis, Sophie Byard, Tom Anderson, Kate Hayes, Mary Evelyn Brown, Harriet Harmon, Jason Sheasley, Ellis Osborne, and Tim Lauer. Thanks for listening, and let's keep exploring what it means to live a good life together. No Small Endeavor is a production of PRX, Tokens Media LLC, and
Great Feeling Studios.
From PRX.